Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Scott Kane. I am the State E-Rate Coordinator for the Kentucky Department of Education. I'm joined today by my partner in E-Rate Hijinks, Caprice Robinson. Caprice and I both serve as the State E-Rate Coordinators. For those of you who are new to this environment, we welcome you. We're thankful that you have joined us. For those of you who are regulars as far as our presentations are concerned, we welcome you back and we thank you for joining us. Today, just a couple of housekeeping things. As always, as we get started, I mention this every time we get started, but I do want to reinforce the fact that we want this to be as interactive as possible, as useful as possible for you, and therefore we will encourage you to ask questions either in the chat or feel free to vocally just jump in and say, hey, Scott, I've got a question, or raise your hand. We will try to address your questions as we go, because usually those questions are relevant to something that has been mentioned as we've been going along. But if you feel like you want to wait and hold on to your question, or perhaps you have something that has some information or some details that you don't want to get into during the session, we will stick around at the end. There will be time for additional questions at the end of the session. And excuse me, we'll turn off the recording so that we can protect anyone who might not want to share any kind of protected information from being recorded. So just wanted to set that expectation up front. And we are today joined by a cadre of folks from OET. I won't go through everybody's name, but I want to thank them for joining us as well. Today, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Today's session is all about competitive bidding and eligible services, particularly newly eligible services. Excuse me, we'll be looking at competitive bidding process. We'll also be looking at WAN refresh. That's a big topic for a lot of folks. I know usually about somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% or so of the districts, pretty much on an annual basis, will be involved in some sort of WAN refresh process in terms of a contract that they may be dealing with. So without further ado, we are going to look at our, as I said, the competitive bidding process. We'll talk about WAN refresh, and then we will go over newly eligible services, specifically bus Wi-Fi and the loaner hotspots, which was just recently added. Bus Wi-Fi was eligible at the beginning of last year, but I don't think that there were too many schools that got into that at that point. We'll take another look at that, and then we'll look at the details around the loaner hotspots, which was just made eligible for 2025. We're going to dive right in. We'll talk about competitive bidding, and we're going to talk about this from a high-level point of view. We're really not going to dive into filing for services, which is under the Form 470. We will have a separate training session that will run through a Form 470, sort of a step-by-step guide approach to that one. Instead, we're going to take a look at some of the rules and the key elements around the competitive bidding process, things that you need to make sure that you are doing, or in some cases not doing, in order to ensure your compliance with the E-Rate program rules. We'll take a look at competitive bidding. Yes, this does reference the FCC Form 470, although, as I said, we won't get into that too much specifically, although we will talk about it. And then we will talk about selecting service providers, things like designing bid evaluations and going through that bid evaluation process. So step one, what is competitive bidding? It's the formal process of choosing your applicant, or of you choosing the service providers who will provide you with the services that you need. Excuse me, once you submit a Form 470, then service providers review your Form 470 and see which services they have that you might need, and then they respond to you by offering you a bid. During this process, you may decide that you just simply don't want to continue to pursue a particular project. That is completely and totally up to you. You are basically just about anywhere within this process. You are well within your rights to simply decide that you don't want to further pursue anything, and at that point you can step away from the process without any kind of significant penalty. There are a few things that are exempt from competitive bidding. They are very, very limited in nature. They are referred to as commercially available business class internet options, or CABIO services. That's the way that USAC likes to refer to them. All of the following requirements must be met in order for something to be considered a commercially available business class internet option, which in this case, those CABIO services are exempt from competitive bidding. Obviously, if it's going to be commercially available, it's got to be commercially available. It has to be publicly available to non-residential customers in the same form and at the same rates that it's offered to schools and or libraries. It has to be low cost. In other words, any one-time costs such as installation plus the pre-discount cost for the service cannot exceed $3,600 per year per school or library. And then it also must be high speed, meaning that you must be able to obtain at least 100 megabits downstream and 10 up in order to qualify as a CABIO service. Excuse me, an applicant using competitive bidding exemption should skip the form 470 if you are opting for a CABIO service. In that case, you would simply create a contract record. There are references to videos for how to do that. Those are available on the USAC website. If you need a link to those, please let me know. I'll be happy to provide them to you. But usac.org/erate is certainly a website that I would encourage you to put into your favorites or your bookmarks so that you can refer to it on a regular basis. It is, again, usac.org/erate. And then you would file a Form 471 and reference that contract record for CABIO services that you have created. Oops, sorry, I'm too far there. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that some equipment out there is only eligible for a portion of that particular service or equipment. You may be purchasing a device, for example, that has both ineligible and eligible components. The example here, a T1 data circuit that also has channels dedicated to voice services. Voice services, as many of you know, are ineligible now and have been since 2019. So such a circuit, you would have to do some sort of cost allocation. We'll talk about cost allocations in a minute in a little bit more detail. But you would have to account for that ineligible portion of the service that you are receiving with respect to how much money you are going to request in support for that service. It's utilized for eligible and ineligible uses. Another example, a server that's used for caching, which is eligible, and video distribution, which is not. Or another option here, or another possibility, is that a service is delivered to both an eligible or an ineligible location. For example, here, the broadband service delivered to a school that's run by a church. The school part of that is eligible, but the church office would be ineligible to receive those E-rate services. So if that same connection were to provide service to both of those locations, you would need to do some sort of cost allocation to account for the ineligible use by that church office or whatever that location might be. There is, as it points out here, no single method to allocate eligible and ineligible costs. What you need to do is start with what they refer to as tangible criteria that results in a reasonable allocation. Just as a number of, by way of example, you could look at the traffic, the internet traffic that goes to two different locations, and I'm using that last example of two different locations as the option. If you have, let's say, for example, a building that houses pre-K. We know that pre-K in Kentucky is not eligible for E-rate. So in an elementary school that houses both K through, let's say, 3, as well as pre-K students, that the one of the ways that you could account for that is to allocate based upon the number of pre-K students that you have versus the number of elementary students you have. You could also use the number of classrooms, pre-K classrooms versus the K and above classrooms. So there are a number of different ways that you can do that. There is no specific method that USAC says you have to do it this way. It's really up to you, as long as you have some way of proving that you have used a tangible criteria and that your result is reasonable because you based it on that, in large part because you based it on that tangible criteria. As a reminder, USAC does not pay for duplicative services. These are services that are provided in duplicate, essentially, obviously, that or redundant services that are sought to reduce reliance here on any single service provider's network for purposes of network outage, or you can fail over, those kinds of things. Those are considered to be ineligible and duplicative. This would be true also with respect to internet service. You already receive internet service from your KEN connection. So any additional internet service that you might receive would be considered duplicative. So needless to say, you won't be applying for or shouldn't be applying for internet access services. That is different, however, is worthy of pointing out, that is different than to say data transport services, which obviously you need data transport services in order to distribute that internet access provided by the KEN connection from one building to another within your district. Services that provide necessary bandwidth requirements, such as multiple T1 lines or bonded fiber strands, those kinds of things, those are not necessarily considered to be duplicative. That's just simply building enough capacity to provide the services necessary to provide that internet access to, that data transport to that location. It is important to note, however, that you still must evaluate and choose the most cost-effective option from your bids received. So, as far as competitive bidding requirements are concerned, what are they? How do they apply to you? First, you must seek competitive bids for eligible equipment and services by filing the Form 470, as we know. Again, we'll talk about the Form 470 in detail on how to do the filing in a future session. Service providers then will view your posting of the Form 470, and they will submit responses to you, to your bid request. You want to make sure that you provide sufficient information for potential bidders to provide a fully comprehensive bid. In other words, you want to make sure that they have everything that they need in their minds already before they submit a response to you, so that their response is as complete as possible to provide you with the best set of information upon which to make your bid evaluations. The FCC Form 470, it must be posted for at least 28 days on the USAC website. So once you've posted it, you have to wait for 28 days before you can select a service provider and enter into a contract with them. You must carefully consider all bids received and then select the most cost-effective service using price as the primary factor. You can look at other criteria, network compatibility, your familiarity with the service, the reputation of the provider, those kinds of things, your prior experience with them. All of those things can be factored in, but price must be the most heavily weighted factor, meaning that if you look at a bid evaluation matrix, you'll see in just a moment what we mean here, that price is going to be assigned with the most potential number of points. Form 470 updates. From time to time, it may be necessary for you to add some additional information to an RFP. Let's say, for example, you post an RFP, and then you realize that after you've posted, that you need to make some sort of clarification to the RFP or to your Form 470 that you didn't make, let's say, in your narrative or somewhere else in your Form 470. You can make that addition or clarification. When you do this, the question is going to be asked to you, does this change or does this addition of a document? Because once you've posted the Form 470, you can come back to it and add additional documentation. And that's an important thing to be able to do because you may have a question and answer document that you want to share with all potential bidders, FAQs, things of that sort. You want to be able to post those so that you can be sure that your competitive bidding process is fair and open, so that all of the potential bidders have access to the same information. You're going to be asked when you go to upload this documentation whether this constitutes a substantial change. Now, we are wading into troubled waters to a certain extent when we talk about substantial change. Obviously, that word substantial is tricky. What exactly constitutes substantial? Well, that's hard to say. That having been said, it's not a lot like one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it, and probably that's the way that USAC will look at it as well. If you are going from, for example, you are requesting 5 access points, and you change your mind and you want to make it 25, that's a 500% increase. I'm going to suggest, and I think probably most of you would agree, that that's a substantial change. You want to make sure that you would then be checking off the yes button to say that yes, this is a substantial change. If you're going from 250 access points down to 225 access points, is that a substantial change? I think you could probably reasonably argue that it's not. You didn't change you changed the amount that you were asking for rather insignificantly. You didn't change the type of service that you're looking for. You didn't change the capacities or the capabilities of the equipment that you were seeking. That I think you could make a reasonable argument is not a substantial change. Unfortunately, without a whole lot of guidance, you have to sort of navigate this on your own in terms of the risks associated with saying no to whether something constitutes a substantial change or not. If it is a substantial change, you are going to essentially reset your 28-day clock. Here you can see, as you select yes, the allowable contract date will automatically be updated to extend by an additional 28 days. So the date of the modification or the new RFP is considered to be day 1. The following day is day 2. You can do the math on that. You get to day 29, and that's the first date that you will be able to will be able to issue a contract and do your bid evaluations. Quick aside here in terms of a competitive bidding tip. I have seen on a number of occasions that a Form 470 is filed and somebody files for basic maintenance of internal connections, but it turns out that the service that was requested was actually internal connections, or vice versa. Either way, the problem is that if your 470 identifies the service that you want, even if it's categorized if it's categorized under the wrong service type, your Form 471 will be denied, and you won't know until your Form 471 gets denied that you've got a problem with your Form 470. Unfortunately, if it's something that you were completely unaware of, which is going to be likely the case, I would imagine. This makes a really, really good point in terms of this tip. if you don't know whether the service falls under one or the other, file for the same service under both service types or all three. You may not know whether it's an internal connection, whether it's MIBS, managed internet broadband services, or basic maintenance of internal connections. You can put the same request for under all three. And that way, if as you go forward, you get to the Form 471 and your application is being reviewed, and somebody comes back to you from PIA and says, we're sorry, but your request is categorized under the wrong service type. If you have a Form 470 where you've requested it in multiple locations, then you can point back to that Form 470 and say, look, I made a clerical error as far as the service type, but on our Form 470, we also have the same request under the other service type, the correct service type. Please switch that. They will switch it for you because they can, because you filed for it on your Form 470. I think that should be fairly explanatory, but if you obviously, as we go forward, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. So when you request services, an RFP can be used, and there are a couple of circumstances in which you are required to use an RFP. Now, when we talk about an RFP in the E-rate world, you're really talking about something that is kind of different from what you would consider to be a traditional RFP. Traditional RFPs are very formal documents. They may have very legal documents. They have all the legal mumbo jumbo and terms and service terms and conditions sought, and very, very prescriptive and descriptive. Those kinds of RFPs, those formal RFPs, are certainly allowable, and they certainly have their place, particularly when we get into large-scale WAN contract or WAN refresh projects. That very detailed RFP can be very, very helpful and very, very useful, and it would be something that you would definitely want to have. And in fact, in some of the cases, in terms of a WAN contract, they are in fact required. That having been said, not everything that is referred to by USAC as an RFP actually looks like a formal RFP. RFP documents really are any document that you provide that gives additional information to the potential bidders about the scope or the details of your project. So it could be something as simple as a one-page bulleted list of features that you're seeking or capabilities of the equipment that you're requesting. It does not have to be a very high level or very formal kind of document. The services that you request on your Form 470 and your RFP need to match. As I mentioned, RFPs are not required for all of them, but they are required for all service types, but they are required for a couple of them. We'll talk about those moving forward. Your documents, RFPs and RFP documents, need to be attached and uploaded in conjunction with your Form 470 in EPIC, the E-Rate Productivity Center. You do have the ability to upload those as you create your Form 470, and you may need to make sure that you do that. Once you indicate on your Form 470 that you have an RFP, I think the very next page actually asks you to go ahead and upload it. So it shouldn't be too hard to make sure that you don't miss those. And then the Form 470, they are going to allow you to upload an RFP document to any non-canceled Form 470, even if that Form 470 didn't originally have an RFP. That is something that is relatively new. Actually, it's new to this year. It's an additional functionality that has finally been added to the Form 470. And in fact, they have actually added the ability to cancel a Form 470. Finally, some almost 10 years later after the implementation of Epic, you will be able to cancel a Form 470 as long as it has not been associated to a Form 471 or an FRN. So some common and competitive bidding errors, things that might get you in some hot water or create some difficulty for you in terms of navigating this process. One of them is providing insufficient information. You want to make sure that you provide full information to potential bidders to provide them information so that they provide you with a comprehensive bid. You want to make sure that your price is the primary evaluation factor. It's most heavily weighted. And with respect to that particular criterion, if you know that you are asking for some things that are E-rate eligible in the project and some things that aren't, when you go to evaluate price, you need to evaluate those prices differently. And that is to say that you can have an E-rate eligible price, E-rate eligible items price component, and then the non-E-rate eligible price component, and evaluate those two things separately. If you do that, you do still need to make sure that the E-rate eligible components of your bid are the most heavily weighted of all of the factors that you are evaluating when it comes to those bids. It is important to note that you cannot have assistance from a service provider or anyone who is a potential bidder to help you file the Form 470. That is a huge no-no. They are not allowed to do that. That would give a single service provider an inside track on what it is that you're doing, and would help them provide potentially a better response to your bid than anyone else, because they have, that inside information. You want to make sure that you retain all of your competitive bidding documentation for 10 years after the last day of services, or the last day to receive services under that particular, under the resulting contract that would or agreement that would come from that competitive bidding process. So it's legitimately possible that you could, this year, ahead of 2025, you file a Form 470 and you go through the competitive bidding process. All the documentation and the contract agreements and everything else that comes along with that ahead of the 2025 year. You get to the end of the 2025 year and services have been completed. If you signed a 5-year contract, let's just say for a WAN refresh, you're going to take through 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. So at the end of the 2029 year, which would be 2030, that would begin the first of the 10 years that you would need to hold on to that documentation. So literally, you could be looking at 16 years for a 5-year contract that you would need to retain all of that documentation, because it's active for the first 5 years, and then you have the 10 years following that activeness where you need to continue to hold on to that documentation. Bottom line is, first of all, keep everything. When it comes to documentation, keep everything. All your lists, your notes, anything that's going to help you demonstrate how you came up with the things that you came up with, your bid evaluation documentation, the matrix, any scoring sheets, which you should have at least one. Sometimes you'll have multiple, depending upon if you have just a single person evaluating a set of bids, or whether you have multiple people doing a group evaluation. All of that documentation needs to be maintained for 10 years after the last day of service under that agreement, or the agreement that's struck as a result of that procurement process. You need to make sure that all your equipment and services that you request on the Form 471 is listed on the Form 470, including all bandwidth speeds. Again, for that WAN contract example, you want to make sure that you are asking for a range of speeds so that you have the flexibility under the resulting contract to increase or decrease bandwidth as you might need going forward. Excuse me. And then you want to make sure that you select a service provider and sign a contract after the allowable contract date and before certifying your Form 471. So it's important to make sure that you have your timing very, very carefully played out so that you can make sure that, for example, if your board is going to need to approve a contract, and I'm sure that that's pretty common, make sure that you build in enough time to have your board certifying your contract so that it is fully official prior to filing the Form 471. Boards usually only meet once a month, sometimes even less than that, depending on the time of year and the circumstances. So you're going to need to make sure that you have if you're going to need that board approval, you're going to need to make sure that that contract goes before the board well before the end of the Form 471 filing window. So if that filing window closes in middle of March and your board meeting is at the end of March, then needless to say, you're going to need to get that contract before the board at the February meeting so that you're ready to file before the close of the window in the middle of March. All right, so selecting service providers. We sort of alluded to this process a little bit already. First, you want to make sure that you are in compliance with the gift rules. You are not permitted to accept or solicit gifts from service providers, and they're not really allowed to give them to you either. They are not allowed to offer you anything of value or significant, excuse me, or to you or personnel involved in your E-rate processes. There are a couple of exceptions. Basically, it comes down to something that is worth less than $20, including a meal or a prize. The total from a single service provider to an individual cannot exceed $50 per year. So I had an example that came up literally just yesterday, where a group of folks are going to be receiving lunch from a service provider, and the concern was, well, the service provider is an E-rate service provider. The question was, well, what's the cost of the lunch that the service provider is providing? Is it less than $20? Thankfully, the answer was yes, and everybody's good to go there as long as they haven't received, other lunches or other de minimis sorts of items in excess of $50 for the current year. Basically, the policy is best applied if a personal policy is best applied to just simply avoid accepting anything from a potential bidder. As far as the gift rules are concerned, you want to make sure that you keep yourself completely on the up and up, and the easiest way to do that is just simply to say thanks, but no thanks. Creating a bid evaluation matrix. When you get incoming bids, you need to have some sort of documentation that allows you to evaluate the bid in some sort of remotely objective fashion. You want to develop your evaluation criteria. You can have more than one. You can have multiple factors. Obviously, your first and primary factor, as mentioned, is price. What's the total cost of the eligible equipment and services? That must be the most heavily weighted factor, but it is not the only one. You may also have straight up disqualifying factors if you don't get your bid, if it's submitted in the wrong fashion, if the service provider is I don't know. I'm trying to think of examples off the top of my head that you could use as straight up disqualifying factors.
If you don't attend a pre-bid meeting.
There you go. That's a great example, Jody. Thank you. That's a really good example. Yeah, nobody from the company attended a pre-bid meeting. That's a really good example. You got to make sure that you list those disqualifying factors. You can use them, but make sure that you list them in the Form 470 narrative. And I would also add in your if you have any RFP documentation, I would put it there as well. You want to make sure that they know up front exactly what steps they are going to have to take. That is they, when I say they, I'm referring to service providers, the steps that they will have to take in order to have a shot at successfully winning your bid. As mentioned, other factors can be considered, but they must be weighted less than the price of the services. So here we have an example. This is a very simple one, but certainly nothing wrong with it. You have a chart that shows the points available for each factor. Then you have a scoring for each vendor, and then you have a total score at the bottom. And as you can see here in this particular example, vendor number 3 is the winner, but with 80 points out of the total possible of 100. And as highlighted by the asterisk there next to the 50 in terms of price, that number on your evaluation, that is how you make sure that your bid is compliant with the requirement that price be the most heavily weighted factor. 28-day waiting period review and reminders. When does the waiting period start? It starts the date that you that you submit the Form 470. If you submit the Form 471 on the 1st of January, you can select a service provider on or after the 29th. So you've waited full 28 days. Day 1 counts. And I think that's really kind of the thing that you need to make sure that you're including in there. Weekends count. Yes, they do. So those are a part of the 28 days. You can select a winner after the 28 days. So in other words, day 29. When's the last date that you can select a vendor? You must select the most cost-effective service offering before you submit a Form 471. So as long as you have not submitted a Form 471, you can still do your bid evaluation, but you can't do your bid evaluations after you've submitted a Form 471, which I'm not sure how you do that to begin with. To be honest with you, I think there are some measures in there to make sure that that doesn't work. But nevertheless, when can you stop receiving bids? Well, that's up to you. There's 2 different options. One is you can set a deadline. In your 470, in your narrative, your RFP, you can say, all right, we will stop accepting bids. And I like to suggest, people post an RFP and a Form 470. I generally will say, make it 30 days instead of 28. Gives you a couple of extra days so that if there was any miscalculation on anybody's part, that you don't need to worry about it. You've waited the full 30 days, and so there's no conflict with the 28-day waiting period. So you can set a specific date, and you might say, well, it's be 30 days after the date of the posting of the Form 470. And then as long as you've set that specific deadline, once you hit that deadline, any response that you receive after that deadline does not have to be evaluated. I would make note of it. I would keep records of the fact that occurred. You can send yourself an email and attach the bid to it and hold on to that email if you need to, just to make sure that you've memorialized the fact that you received the bid after your deadline. But if you don't add a deadline to your narrative or your RFP or the Form 470, you will have to accept bids up until the time that you actually go through the process of evaluating those bids. So let's say that you go your 28 days, and 5 days after the 28-day waiting period, you start bid evaluations. If you received any bids in those 5 days, you need to be sure to include those in the bid evaluation. Once you've completed your bid evaluation, if you receive responses after that date, you do not need to evaluate those bid responses, after the fact. You will have already selected your winner. My suggestion to you in an instance of that sort is to reach out to that service provider, provide them with an email, and just simply say, thank you for your interest, but we have already completed our bid evaluation. And we're no longer, that is no longer an active Form 470 or RFP because that process has been closed out. Here's a good example in terms of the calendar. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this, but as you can see, the example here, day one is the date of the upload. Day 28 is the 28th of that month, and then the 29th is the first date that you can select a vendor. You can go through that process. I won't belabor this one any further, really. What if you receive no bids? Well, you can then, after the 28-day waiting period, proactively go out and solicit bids. You can ask specific specific providers to go ahead and respond to your bid. You can ask your current provider to submit a bid if you have a current provider for the service that you're looking for. And after that, if you get still only one bid, as long as it is cost effective, you can then select that as your winner. You must still evaluate the bid and demonstrate cost effectiveness. So even if you didn't get a bid to begin with, you should go ahead and fill out your bid evaluation matrix, because that is in USAC's mind, or in their eyes, that is the way to make sure that something is cost effective. They will see that and say, okay, you've evaluated it, you've made a determination that yes, this still is cost effective for the district. So the only way that you can show that you've actually done that in receiving that one bid is to go ahead and fill out your bid evaluation matrix for that one bid that you've received. In this instance where you receive only one bid, be sure to create some sort of memo for your files, whether it's an email to yourself or perhaps to your superintendent or finance officer, just mentioning to them, hey, as of today was the last day to collect the bids, and we're starting our bid evaluation, and we only received one bid. Just something along those lines. Mention who it was from. Probably is a really good idea there as well, just to cover your bases. They will ask, well, you only received one bid, show us where it was that you memorialized this fact. On to contract. So you've selected a winner of your bid, and it's time to have some sort of legally binding agreement in place. It is required that you have a contract or other legally binding agreement in place prior to submitting your Form 471. Again, as mentioned, that may have implications for your timeline in terms of any activity that has to happen within the district or between the district and the service provider to hammer out a contract and an agreement prior to the close of the Form 471 window. You cannot sign a contract prior to the allowable contract date on your Form 470 receipt notification letter, which is obviously 28 days after the Form 470 is certified. Your signed contract constitutes the best evidence that a legally binding agreement exists. There are others, but they are a little bit less reliable in terms of whether or not USAC will accept them or not. So that signed contract is going to be critical to have. And when I say signed contract, we're talking about for purchases, for contracts like a WAN contract where you have an ongoing agreement. Purchase orders, things of that sort, are much more common in terms of Category 2 acquisitions. Those things don't usually, if you're buying, if you're purchasing a UPS, for example, you probably won't have a formal contract, but you would have some sort of purchase agreement, and you want to make sure that you have evidence of that, and that is dated after the 28-day waiting period required. And last, certainly but not least, verbal offer or acceptance is not considered as will not be considered as evidence of the existence of a legally binding agreement. Contract mistakes to avoid. You want to make sure that the contract contains signature and date. That seems like something simple, but I've seen a couple of examples where a contract was sent and it was signed by the service provider, but a signed copy from the applicant was not available, or vice versa. There was no signature from the service provider. Make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And you want to make sure that there are terms and conditions and contains a written acceptance of the offer. The contract binding or legally binding agreement has to be negotiated on or after the 28 days. Excuse me, and it needs to be negotiated and executed on or before the submission of the Form 471. I'm going to stop just for a second and see if we have any questions over the competitive bidding process as a whole. Hearing none, I'm going to move on. Let's reopen the fire hose. When we talk about WAN refresh, I want to make clear that I'm really only talking about, we're going to be dealing primarily, I should say, with fiber services. There is one exception to that, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But I think everybody, I'm sure that everyone in the state of Kentucky in public schools has fiber between their buildings. So that's really what we're talking about, is a fiber refresh or a WAN refresh. We're going to look at identifying the eligible services and charges, installment plans and state match funds, although we don't really have any state match funds for special construction. So that's, we can skip quickly through that. We'll talk about RFPs for fiber service and the various service options that you have, evaluating the cost effectiveness of those service options, and then service delivery deadlines and extensions. And we'll talk about the service provider's role and any Form 471 tips that you have, or that we have for you. There are primarily three different ways that you can deliver transport for your district. It is through leased lit fiber, leased dark fiber, or a self-provisioned network. The self-provisioned network is just another way of saying it's district owned. You build out, you manage, you construct, you do all of those things, lighting the fiber, maintaining the fiber, maintaining the network. All of that is done within the district. Or in some cases, for example, management thereof, the district may own it, but then hire out a third party to do the management of it. Now, that's still going to be considered self-provisioned because the district has ownership of the fiber in the ground or on the poles. There is, and this I kind of alluded to a moment ago, for leased lit fiber, we are talking obviously about fiber. For leased dark fiber, we are talking about obviously fiber. When you get to self-provisioned networks, if you are going to seek a self-provisioned network, you must seek support in a technology neutral fashion. In other words, you can't say, we want a self-provisioned fiber network. You are going to have to go out to the world and say, we want a self-provisioned network that delivers our delivers or offers or makes available transport at such and such a speed, and you can lay out all the parameters, but you cannot simply say we want fiber. If you do that, your request for your self-provisioned network will be thrown out on essentially a technicality. You didn't say to the world, hey, we're willing to accept bids for something other than fiber. cable, microwave, satellite, all different options that could help deliver transport to you. You need to be evaluating all of those different options as a part of requesting a self-provisioned network. That is different if you are going to be just looking for either leased fiber or leased lit fiber or leased dark fiber. In those two cases, you can go and say to the world, hey, we want fiber. We'll take leased, or we'll take lit fiber, or we'll take dark fiber. Or you might just go out to the world and say, hey, all we want is leased lit fiber. And in that case, you've kind of got the easiest climb ahead of you as far as that's concerned. But you do have these three different eligible transport options.
Hey, Scott, this is Jeremy Simpson. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I had added to ask this in the chat, and Jody was responding to me. We have always done at least dark fiber. We get a great rate from a local cable company, but we had thought about if we self-provisioned our network, then all we would have to pay once you have your initial cost, you're only going to have to pay for the maintenance, which would be considerably cheaper. But when you were talking about the competitive bidding, what's going to be a lot cheaper on the competitive bidding to go with either the least lit or the least dark initially, because they're going to be breaking that, the cost down. Like for us, we only pay like $28,000 a year. But if I do self-provisioned, if they're going to construct it, it may be $150,000 to $200,000 a year, but it's a one-time cost, and then we're only paying maintenance after that. So how, and Jody was responding to it, how does that work with USAC that, you're going to have a huge upfront cost, but, over the course of the next 20 years, it's going to be considerably cheaper. Whereas if you did the lease lit, it's going to be cheaper over the course of each year. How does USAC look at that in terms of competitive pricing?
Well, you just put your finger on it, Jeremy, when you mentioned comparing it over the course of the 20 years. If you have a an expected lifespan of 20 years on the self-provision network, then what you would do is when you go to compare costs, you're going to have to say, okay, well, the least lit would cost X amount per year. Multiply that times 20. The dark fiber total cost, and I'm talking total costs here, considering also, network equipment, management, maintenance, those kinds of things, all the things that you would pay for yourself under a self-provision network or a dark fiber solution, those are going to have to be calculated in some fashion to your total cost over the 20 years. I think that's the way that you need to be able to break it down. I would think that you would, I would put together a spreadsheet that shows how I've broken it down. Vendor X is offering me least lit fiber at X cost. There really are no other costs associated with that because it's least lit fiber. And so we took that and we multiplied it by 20 because you have to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And one of the ways that you do that is to compare the same time period in terms of your total cost of ownership. And you do the same thing with the least dark fiber, whereas with the dark fiber, you may have maintenance operations charges, you may have installation charges, you may have network equipment that needs to be factored in. You're going to have to refresh that network equipment probably every 3 to 5 years, maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less. That obviously that's going to be to a certain extent up to you. I would try to use what's considered to be sort of industry standard as far as that network equipment is. So 3 to 5 years, somewhere in that neighborhood is how often you probably would be refreshing some of that equipment. Those costs need to be factored into the total cost of the dark fiber and the self-provisioned calculations. And then you, again, over the course of the 20 years, my leased fiber is going to cost me X from this vendor. From vendor B, they're going to offer me dark fiber and it's going to cost me Y. Over 20 years, and the self-provisioned over the course of 20 years is going to cost me a total of Z. And then you're going to look at X, Y, and Z and compare which one is the lower cost, and then assign a point value to that on your bid evaluation matrix.
You think we should? It does, yeah, 100%.
Okay,
That's
okay.
exactly sort of what I was thinking in my head. I just
Yep.
didn't know how USAC would view that. And
Yeah, and go ahead.
would you recommend doing these as, because I normally do my least lit and my least dark together in one 470. Would you recommend doing the self-provision as a completely different 470, or can we just do one that covers all three?
You'll actually have to do it all on the same one. If you're
Okay.
gonna if you're gonna request self-provisioned in any fashion, you need to absolutely have to request both least lit and least dark on that same 470 as a
Well,
part of that process. So yeah, you
yeah,
have
that
to.
makes it easier. So I
Yeah.
just want to make sure.
Yep. Yep. Good questions, and I think you actually kind of touched on some stuff that we're going to get into. So I will be able to go a little faster. It is worthy of note. And Jeremy, did you have anything else?
No, sir, that was it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Sure, no problem. No problem. I do want to talk about special construction a little bit. Special construction may be necessary as a part of your as a part of a request for services, for example, out to a new building, or you've got I think of what I was trying to say there, but there might be a number of different circumstances where there needs to be some sort of build that occurs prior to the delivery of services, that where somebody's got to come out and attach fiber to poles or dig trenches, those kinds of things. Those activities are referred to as special construction, and special construction charges are eligible for Category 1 support. These special charges that are eligible consist of three different components. That can be construction of the network, the design and engineering, and then project management to make sure that fiber or whatever service gets installed correctly. You can seek funding for special construction in connection with least lit, least dark, and self-provisioned networks. So it doesn't matter which one. Sometimes, no matter which one you're going to do, the special construction may be necessary. As I said, a good example of that would be when you have a new building. Special construction charges do not include charges for network equipment, or the maintenance and operations of the fiber. So if you're going to seek bids for network equipment and maintenance and operations in relation to least dark fiber, and by the way, you won't get network equipment or maintenance and operations with least lit fiber, because those are provided to you as a part of your least lit service. But if you're going to seek those kinds of things in relation to a dark fiber service, the bids for these services must be requested on the same Form 470. So it kind of comes back to what Jeremy was asking about. You want to keep anything that's associated with that project together on the same Form 470. Same basically applies for the requests on the Form 471. You want to make sure that those things are all together on the same forms.
Scott?
Yeah.
Stephen Gum has a question. He says that he owns his own fiber, and he's asking if they are doing, he says that they are doing construction and talking about putting it underground. And he's asking, would this fall anywhere in this? If he's doing his own construction and putting it underground.
So so if I understand that, then the sense of the refresh would be that you're moving fiber from poles to subterranean, and that would essentially be you're sort of rebuilding. Am I understanding that? It sounds like that's
yes.
Okay. Yeah, Steve, I think that that would be, I mean, that would be potentially eligible for support. Those special construction charges. That's going to be a part of building out that self-provision network. You would need to go out to bid for that work to be done and you would need then to successfully get E-rate funding for your self-provisioned network prior to doing that. But yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, you're basically rebuilding the network by putting it underground rather than having it on the poles.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. Milestone payments. As you go through the special construction process, you may find that your provider wants to have once they reach certain milestones within the project, they have a certain payment that they want to be associated with that. You can charge. You can submit invoicing for get reimbursement for those for that special construction for those special construction charges at any point during the funding year, meaning that you can once that construction starts, any of those charges, as long as you have entered the funding year, you can submit invoices for reimbursement. You note that you cannot receive support for recurring charges. That is basically your monthly service fee. If those charges occurred prior to the funding year, let's say that you got your project, the special construction was completed in April and services began in May. Well, you didn't file for a recurring service for May and June. So those recurring charges that you incur in May and June, because they are outside of the funding year that begins July 1, you would have to cover those costs yourself. Those costs would be ineligible. Probably not going to be something that most of you will run into. Whether you are filing for lit, dark, or self-provisioned, your special construction must be completed in time for the fiber to be lit by the end of that funding year. So if you're filing for special construction charges for 2025, you need to make sure that whatever gets installed through that special construction gets used by the end of the funding year. If that June 30 deadline for lighting it up, for making it work, is not met, then your special construction charges will not be eligible for support. And that means that if you have already submitted invoices and received funding, and then you're not able to get your network up and running prior to that June 30 deadline, you will have to give those funds that you receive for the special construction back to USAC. So you need to be absolutely certain that you're going to be able to get your project completed by the end of the funding year for which you are applying, and make sure that things are up and running. You can enter into installment payments, payment plans, to cover your non-discounted share. If there is an interest that is associated with those installment plans, you need to say so on your Form 470, but be aware that service providers are not obligated to offer that to you. That's just it's not like a SPY or a BEAR where you choose. This is something that they either will or won't agree to in the long run. But you do have to indicate your interest on the Form 470 as you go out to bid. If a service provider chooses to offer you an installment plan, they must disclose all the material terms and conditions, the interest rate, and the term of the payment plan. The payment plan cannot exceed more than 4 years, and the interest and finance charges are not E-rate eligible charges, and therefore must be deducted from the funding request. Competitive bidding rules specific to fiber. If you are seeking only leased fiber, all you have to do is post a Form 470 and indicate that you are seeking least lit fiber. In your narrative, you want to identify the locations where it's going to go out to, speeds that you're seeking, any other sort of technical components to the capabilities of that which you are asking for. If you are going out for least dark fiber, program rules require that you must also consider least lit options as well as dark options. And then you do a cross comparison, as I mentioned, sort of in response to Jeremy's question. For a self-provision network, you are going to consider all three. Basically, you're going to ask for all three. Do not request, as I mentioned before, do not request only fiber. Make sure that you say very clearly that you are seeking self-provisioned network capacity, and then go through the myriad of details. Yes, your details of what it has to be able to do may be and probably will be the thing that will clearly delineate between whether you are seeking, microwave services, cable, et cetera. Just the speeds alone that are available from fiber versus some of those other options is probably what's going to separate the men from the boys, so to speak. That's going to be the way that you break down exactly what capabilities your network has is going to be the thing that's going to make it clear that a service provider is going to have to be offering you a fiber solution rather than anything else. Just make sure you don't say we prefer fiber. Don't say you have a preference for anything, because that will get you denied, straight up denied. And unfortunately, we have seen that happen in the past. So please make sure that does not happen to you. The Form 470 and RFP should be enough information to solicit comprehensive proposals. I've mentioned that previously. I won't belabor that point. If you are posting an RFP for multiple service types, make sure that your RFP addresses all of the solutions for services that you are seeking, and make sure that it does not indicate a preference for one solution over another. Although the E-rate rules do not specifically require applicants to prepare a separate RFP for any eligible service, applicants seeking bids for dark fiber or self-provision networks or the other option are required to upload an RFP in Epic. So be prepared. Those of you who seek dark fiber or self-provision, you are going to have an RFP. Now, again, how you define that RFP, we talked about that to begin with early on. It doesn't have to be even this doesn't have to be a formal, very structured RFP. It can be a couple of page document that outlines exactly what you're seeking. That having been said, particularly with a self-provision network, you're going to want to be as detailed as possible. So it is worth your time and your effort to be very, very careful in how you construct that. And given that that's the case, you'd want to start perhaps like tomorrow. Applicants are required to demonstrate that you've selected the most cost-effective service. When you consider the bids for fiber options, the cost-effectiveness analysis should include, and we kind of touched on these when I was talking about or in responding to Jeremy's question. Make sure that your cost-effectiveness analysis, your bid evaluation, includes a comprehensive breakdown of the cost of the chosen service over the other available options. So like I said, you have a spreadsheet where you've broken down all of the main components of cost that go into delivering the service to you. Make sure that there's an evaluation of the expected useful life of what it is that you're putting in. So make sure that if you are applying for self-provision service, you would want to perhaps figure that the life of that might be 20 years. And so you make sure that you're comparing 20 years to 20 years to 20 years across self-provision, dark, and lit fibers. And then if considering the least dark option or for that matter, self-provision. This would also mean that you should include a comparison of the charges associated with not only leasing, but then the equipment and maintenance and operations, management and operations of the cost compared over time. Comparison time period must be defensible and aligned with the applicant's anticipated use of the assets. In other words, I would suggest that if there are industry standards or accepted industry practice, that you tend to lean on those elements. Decisions must have a tangible basis and the results should be reasonable. So, for example, you can't just make up numbers for the cost of a piece of equipment that might have to be replaced over the course of your contract for dark fiber. Make sure that you've got some sort of reasonable estimate for that. Where did you get that estimate? Is it, you could go off of CAT's contract pricing and use that as the basis for how you make those determinations. But make sure that you have some sort of tangible basis. You can't just simply pull out of the air a random number and plug it in. It needs to be a reasonable and reasonable and based in some sort of reality. Include any explanations on any assumptions that you made in terms of the expected useful life, frequency of equipment refreshes, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, if we're talking about a self-provision network and we're talking about a 20-year period, you might say, okay, well, after the first 5 years, we're starting with a fresh network to begin with, and then each 5 years at 5, 10, and 15, we will be replacing the equipment. So you need to figure out what your cost of equipment refresh is going to take place. How much is that? And then include that into the assumptions that you're making in terms of the total cost of ownership over the life of the expected life of your network. Self-provision networks, consider all the costs of owning, and I just mentioned this as well. You make sure that you're including all of those. Yeah, this is repetitious. I apologize. All right, so when you're preparing your funding request, you need to be prepared to provide an explanation of the cost effectiveness of your service selection. Provide line item level details on any charges related to the service. Work with your service provider. You've already selected one now, so you can now begin to work with them and have them help you to explain the reasonableness and any need for associated costs. Pole, make ready, trenching, handholds, vaults, splices, number of strands, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure that you have a map of where those things are going to go, just particularly with your special construction. Cost per foot evaluation, and then communicating the time frame when the investment of USF will yield cost savings. Again, that's primarily associated with your special construction, either for dark or dark or self-provision fiber. In terms of cost allocation, you are subject to the same cost allocation requirements, so that when you're talking about you may need to be doing cost allocation for use by ineligible entities, ineligible users, or at ineligible locations. Any three of those would need to be will be a reason why you would need to make some sort of cost allocation. That is to say that you're going to remove a certain amount of funds that you are requesting because you're representing that going to an ineligible user location or entity. The question?
It looks like somebody's talking.
I think you
I
are.
think I joined the wrong. Hang on.
If you could mute, thank you. Okay. And on. Cost allocation requires clear delineation of costs. It must be based on a reasonable, tangible result, and it must be supported by documentation. Be sure that when we talk about that tangible basis, that you have some sort of some sort of documentation that is the foundation for which you've or upon which you have made those calculations. And a reminder that all fiber and facilities installed as a part of a self-provision network must be owned by the eligible school or library and not be used by other entities. In other words, you cannot resell it. Special construction charges are only eligible for support if the new fiber is lit by the end of the funding year. I mentioned that. Additionally, excess strands may be installed for the applicant's exclusive future use, but the future strands are not covered now. So only the strands that will be lit within that funding year will be eligible. Now, you're already building, you're already constructing, so it's probably standard practice to drop in 12, 24, 36 strands, whatever that number might be, but you might only be using 6 of the 12 or 8 of the 12 or 4 of the 24, whatever it might be. Those excess strands will need to be factored out of the amount that you're requesting with respect to your special construction charges. Probably not going to be a huge amount, and it's probably just going to be calculated as a percentage of the cost of the actual fiber cable itself, because those cables, have the bundled, 12, 24, 36, whatever number of strands. So you basically just, and it's going to be cost at a per foot cost. So you just do a percentage. So if you're going to use 8 of the 16 strands, obviously 50% of the cost of the cable itself is going to be eligible. The other 50% will then need to be cost allocated out. You don't need to do the same thing with the cost of actually digging the trench or putting the fiber on the pole. Those costs are going to be the same no matter whether or not you're putting in 2 strands or 200 strands. So for obvious reasons, then you're not going to be cutting into that. It's only the excess strands that you will need to factor out of your funding requests. Installation of Category 1 non-recurring services, special construction charges, may begin 6 months prior to the July 1 start of the funding year, or in other words, after January 1st, if the following conditions are met. 1, construction begins after the selection of the service provider pursuant to a valid competitive bidding process. So let's say that tomorrow you start the process, and at the end of December, you've selected a service provider based upon you followed all the E-rate rules, you filed a Form 470, you issued the RFP along with it, you waited your 28 days, you've gone through the process of evaluating the bids, you've got all your ducks in a row. You can start on July or January 1 if you so choose. Now, are you putting yourself to a certain extent at risk? Yes. Why? Because you don't have a funding commitment from E-rate yet. So you probably want to make sure that you're in a position where you are going to do this no matter whether you get the E-rate funding or not. Or you're going to need to wait until you see whether you get the E-rate funding before you start the construction. That's going to be up to you how you want to handle that. But you are allowed under the rules to begin as early as January 1 if you base it on a properly competitively bid process. And a Category 1 recurring services will depend upon the installation of that infrastructure. Excuse me. And the actual start date for the recurring service is on or after the start of the funding year. Note also that you will have to, and as I mentioned before, you will have to make sure that that service that has been put in based on that special construction is lit up and actively being used as of the end of the funding year. There is no extension for recurring charges. So if you're not done or if you're not lit up and operational by June 30th, there is no extension available to get that to allow you to then meet that requirement. Make sure that you are going to meet that requirement up front. Service delivery deadlines. Applicants may not receive E-rate support for any recurring charges incurred outside of the funding year. The E-rate support is only available for recurring charges for leased lit fiber service delivered within that funding year. Obviously, there's generally no special construction associated with that, although there might be. And then applicants may not receive support for recurring charges for leased dark fiber until the fiber has been lit up. In other words, they got to be put in place, and somebody's got to hit the switch on the GBICs to make it active. At that point, you may start to incur cost and bill it back to E-rate. Applicants may not receive E-rate support for recurring charges associated with a self-provision network until the network is constructed and in use. Now, those recurring charges might fall under the category of managed internet broadband, internal broadband services. Those would also apply. Those are recurring charges that are associated with your self-provision network, but you can't be charged for monitoring and operations of your network if your network is not actively in use. Applicants may only request E-rate support for special construction charges related to leased lit fiber and leased dark fiber if the fiber is lit within the same funding year. As mentioned previously about self-provision, that also applies to both the others, lit and dark. And then the network must be constructed and in use by the end of the same funding year as the funding request. That kind of makes perfect sense there. And then construction deadlines, you may request a 1-year extension to complete special construction under a certain set of circumstances. This has to do with either weather or saturated frozen ground, natural disasters, pandemics. Let's hope there's no more of those to come anytime soon. Scheduled delivery of required plant components don't arrive. Various supply chain issues, things of that sort. Or USAC issues an FCDL too late for the applicant to complete the special construction and light the fiber by the end of the funding year. If they don't issue you an FCDL until, let's say, March, there's no way that you're going to have time to complete the special construction by the end of that funding year, in which case you can request a special construction extension deadline. But you must make sure, as this slide shows, you must be sure to do that prior to the end of the funding year. If you do not, you are in trouble. And when I say in trouble, you will basically be incurring the total cost of that project upon yourselves and essentially denying yourselves E-rate support. Service providers, what can they do once the application, once they have been selected? They can assist you in filling out your Form 471. They can't help with your 470. They can help with your 471. They are allowed to speak directly and respond to PIA questions. Obviously, you want to be aware of what's being said and what's being shared, but they can help respond to any questions you might get about your project. And that's quite possible, particularly if you are going after self-provision fiber. The set of questions that you will receive, and when I say you will receive, I mean you will receive. If you have selected a self-provisioned option, you are going to receive a lengthy set of questions, and that set of questions you will probably need some help with in responding. You'll need that help from your service provider. They can help explain why your service offering is cost-effective, and then they can help work with you to provide details to that PIA reviewer with information requests. Questions over the WAN contracts and fiber? Hearing none.
Man, it's a lot. Well, no, it's not a question, just something you may want to reiterate with folks here, because that's just a lot of really awesome information. And one thing I know sometimes gets confusing for districts is we talk so much about when the filing window is going to open. And a lot of times we get districts that think, well, I'll wait when this window opens, I can start all of this. So much of what you just talked about, they can be working on right now. That might be something you want to reiterate.
Yes. Particularly with The more complex dark fiber self-provisioned, that can be a lengthy process. And I joked earlier about saying, well, you should start tomorrow. Probably yesterday would have been better. Yeah, the level of detail and thought and planning that has to go into um, this process would dictate that now is a good time to start. Don't wait until the filing window opens. That's just the time period during which you can file a Form 471. That should not be the trigger for beginning the process.
Exactly. And sometimes it turns out that people do it that way, but you can file your 470 now. You can wait your 28 days right now. You can do the bid evaluation that Scott went through. You can actually choose your provider. I think you can execute a contract even. You just can't file all of that in a 471 until the window opens. So you could really do everything else so that day one, when the window opens, you just be ready to file. And that goes for whether you're doing a 470 or services that you're seeking a contract for, or if you're doing a mini bid off of the state networking contracts. So
correct.
Sorry about that, Scott.
No need to apologize, Jody. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, newly eligible services. We're going to take a look at bus Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi hotspots. Bus Wi-Fi actually began last year. As I mentioned earlier, I think probably only a handful of schools actually went after the bus Wi-Fi. And I'd be interested actually in hearing from them, just having a conversation about that real briefly. But nevertheless, it is eligible now for E-rate support when it is being used for educational purposes. Now, when I say educational purposes, well, it kind of means, in a broad sense, you're not allowed to just take the bus and go find a cul-de-sac and park it and then provide Wi-Fi to the community. You've got to be delivering students to and from a school activity of some sort, whether it be morning and afternoon, heading to and from school, or field trips, athletic events, things of that sort. When you've got the teams on the buses, and you want to make sure or you want to make available them to have Wi-Fi as they travel to do various things like homework and so on and so forth on those buses. Those are eligible, but certainly, as I said, using it for anything outside of those kinds of purposes, that is going to be ineligible, and that ineligible use would need to be cost allocated in some fashion. Installation fees and equipment needed to make the wireless service on the school buses is also eligible, and it's eligible under Category 1. Both of them are, the service and the installation. And then separate maintenance and operation services related to this connectivity is not eligible. That's probably going to be something that's taken care of by your service provider anyway. So it's really not something that's going to be able to be broken out to begin with. Wi-Fi bus Wi-Fi services are eligible for buses that are school-owned, as well as the leased or contracted school buses, provided that those school buses are used to transport students to and from school and school-related activities. Occasionally used charter buses, for example, we've got a fancy bus that for the school for field trips, or municipal buses, or the band. The band truck that carries all of the pit percussion equipment, not eligible. A car or other van, you think yellow bus. Or I think that's the safest way of think yellow bus. Equipment and services must be primarily used for educational purposes, as already mentioned a couple of times. There are no new user or SIPA restrictions adopted for bus Wi-Fi, but that still means that SIPA applies in the sense that all in any of your filtering services, your content management services, those kinds of things must still be in place on the Wi-Fi that is being provided on the bus. The Wi-Fi on buses should only be active during school bus normal operating hours. In other words, before or after when students are being transported, or when that bus is being used for a clear educational purpose. Outside of those hours, weekends, for example, unless the bus is taking kids to and from an athletic event. Those Wi-Fi hotspots that are on those buses need to be turned off. And then security cameras for buses are not eligible for E-rate support. So there is a possibility. There are certain situations in which a rural school might need an agreement with multiple service providers in order to cover all of their bus routes. There may be certain bus routes that can only be served by one and not the other. In those instances, a district may actually end up entering into agreements with multiple providers that aren't going to be considered duplicative or redundant. School bus Wi-Fi is subject to all existing E-rate rules and requirements in terms of competitive bidding, cost allocation, discounting, documentation retention, et cetera, et cetera. SIPA compliance, all of that continues to apply. Applicants who entered into multi-year agreements for bus Wi-Fi under ECF are not exempt from the competitive bidding requirements. Whoops. That is to say that let's say that you have a bus Wi-Fi contract already that you established under ECF. You can use that contract and get E-rate support for it. But the only way to do that is to go back out to bid, accept any additional bids that you might receive, and then include your existing contract as if it had been submitted to you as a bid and include it in the bid evaluation. And then if the existing contract wins that competition, that sort of then translates or imparts E-rate eligibility to that contract because it has won a competitive bidding process. I hope that makes some sense. The competitive bidding exemption for Cabio services does not apply to bus services, only to school building services. And the service provider selection must be consistent with E-rate rules in terms of selecting the most cost-effective service offering. So that's a quick look at Wi-Fi buses for Wi-Fi hotspots. New to this year, 2025, they are making eligible Wi-Fi hotspots for student and staff use off premises. This is something that's new. This is for students and or staff that do not have or do have but have limited connectivity at home that need more robust connectivity in order for them to take full advantage of the educational opportunities provided by the district. The intention here, again, is to provide that as its sole function. We're really not here. We're not out to provide connectivity to the family at home. There should be basically a 1-to-1 ratio of student to household where it goes. And it needs to be and it needs to be assigned to a specific student. It's basically, think about it like a library checkout kind of thing, where the kid needs some additional support at home, perhaps, and so you check out the device to them. They can take it home, and then they have access at home as well as at school. These off-premise hotspots and will be these Wi-Fi hotspots equipment and services requests will be prioritized after on-premise Category 1 and 2 equipment service requests in the event that demand exceeds available funding. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't know that this Wi-Fi hotspot thing is going to be particularly large in terms of the level of demand. And for that matter, at this point in time, there is a rather rather comfortable gap between the funding cap for the program and actually how much is used on a yearly basis. So the yearly consumption of the total cap, with it being below the total cap on a regular basis, would seem to indicate that it's unlikely that they will have to do any kind of prioritization for the Wi-Fi hotspots. But if it does happen, they will fund Category 1 and Category 2 first, and then they will come back to off-premises Wi-Fi hotspots and then begin to fund it. And your Wi-Fi hotspot funding requests will be limited to a fixed 3-year budget cycle. And I will talk about that budget in just a moment. To be E-rate eligible, a hotspot must be portable. It must be a single device, not a set of linked ones, and it must be used for use with a commercially available mobile wireless internet service from your big providers that we all know their names, or maybe even a local provider. We still don't. I'm sure you know their name. I might not. What is not eligible? Multifunctional devices, a smartphone, PC, a netbook. Notebooks, tablets, customer premise equipment, routers, switches, access points. It's just the hotspot. It's the device, and that's the service attached to it. The wireless service is delivered to any broadband-enabled end-user devices, like directly to a laptop or tablet. That is not eligible as well. This is to a hotspot device, and then from that device, Wi-Fi signal is translated out. One-to-one Wi-Fi hotspot initiatives are not permitted. In fact, you'll see when we talk about the budget, it's not even really possible under this program. Each Wi-Fi hotspot must have an associated line of service to be eligible for this funding. So what is one-to-one is not the hotspot to child, but hotspot to line of service. And then additionally, these Wi-Fi hotspots cannot be warehoused or stored for future use or as replacements for lost, damaged, or stolen devices. So you can't keep a store of them in back, a set of backups that you regularly, or that you have in case you need to roll them out. So let's talk about these budgets and how this works. Eligible schools and libraries will be eligible for a budgeted amount of pre-discount support for off-premises Wi-Fi hotspots and services over a 3-year funding cycle. The first 3-year funding cycle will begin in 2025 and run through 2027, after which the budgets will reset for funding year 2028. Please don't ask me, I love you all, but please don't ask me why they didn't just do a 5-year budget cycle that would match up with Category 2. I don't know. Would have made a lot of sense to me, but never mind. Nobody asks me, and it's probably a good thing that they don't. The budgets will rely on pre-discount funding caps of $15 per month for recurring wireless internet service and a $90 per hotspot device. So you think about that. Well, let's see, 150. Let's see. I'm sorry, not 150, but $15 per month times 12. Ooh, if I can do some math really quick, I think that's $180 plus 90 is that right? 150, 180, and 90. It's 270. Yes, that's right. So in the first year, the year in which you would purchase the $90 hotspot, you would have $270 to spend as far as that one hotspot is concerned. However, you are limited because the total amount of your budget is calculated by multiplying your student count by 20%. In other words, they're only allocating enough Wi-Fi hotspots to have a one student or a one hotspot for every 5 students ratio. So you're going to take your student count, multiply that times 20%, and then adjust that and then adjusting that to your Category 1 discount rate. This means the number. So you're going to have to take your number of students multiplied by 20% and then round it up to the nearest 10. Multiply that number times the 3-year total cost of the funding cap. That is $90 in the first year plus 3 years of $180 gives you a 3-year total of $630 per hotspot to determine your budget. So you have $630 times the number of students times 20% that gets rounded to the nearest 10. A little complicated, kind of hard to give you like an actual formula on here. It would probably look more like some sort of Excel formula than a typical, sort of arithmetic sort of formula. But that should give you the information that you can use to calculate your hotspot budget. And then the hotspot services purchased with E-rate support may only be used by students, staff, and students and staff, and no more than one hotspot may be distributed per user. I would also suggest that you might want to make sure that you do a sibling check to make sure that you're not sending one home with 2 students from the same household. Eligible schools and libraries will be required to update and publicly post an acceptable use policy that states that the off-premise use of the Wi-Fi hotspot or service is primarily for educational uses, and that the Wi-Fi hotspot service is for use by students, staff, school, and school personnel, and them alone. Now, that does mean that if you are going to pursue this, you do need to update you will probably, I'm assuming that you don't have this already in your acceptable use policy. Make sure that you add it to that. And I would suggest very strongly that you do that at the same time, if not perhaps just prior to going out to bid for these hotspots, if that's a direction that you are electing to go. The rules establish a verification process to ensure that these hotspots are in use. With respect to unused lines, at least once every 31 days, basically once a month, your service provider is going to be required to determine whether any of your supported lines have 0 data usage in the prior 60 days, and then provide you notice that that particular line has not been used for the last 60 days, and they need to provide that to you within 5 business days. If that same line goes for an additional 30 days to now meet or exceed 90 days, the service provider is going to be required to discontinue service to that line. Now, it will be shut off, and you will have been notified that it was going to be a month ahead of time, so that you can make sure that ones that have been unused are the next ones to get loaned out, for example. The data usage report. Service providers must provide reports regarding the Wi-Fi hotspot data usage to you, and you are required to make those reports available to any representative, including any auditor appointed by a state education department, USAC, the FCC, or any local, state, or federal agency within the jurisdiction with jurisdiction over the entity upon request. Now, I'm not going to be asking you for that. I can't see any situation where we would necessarily ask you for that, but you've obviously seen FCC, USAC, or auditor. Make sure you keep these reports. You will be asked for them under audit. I am absolutely certain. So there's some additional documentation that you are going to need to keep that is outside of that which you are accustomed to keeping necessarily for other E-rate program or other E-rate eligible services. For each hotspot or line of service, you are going to be required to maintain an asset and service inventory list. Okay, so you can keep equipment make and model number, serial number, the full name of the person to whom the equipment was provided. That's for schools only. The dates the equipment was loaned out and was returned, or the date that the school was notified the equipment was missing, lost, or damaged, and the service detail, the line number or other unique identifier that associates that device to a particular line of service. So you're going to have to keep your asset inventory just like you do for other things, as well as that documentation that or that use documentation that your service provider provides you. And of course, as always, SIPA applies. Your connections through these must be filtered in some fashion. I have thrown down the gauntlet for you. I wish there was a better way to do that, but unfortunately, there really isn't. It's just the nature of the program, unfortunately. My question to you is, what questions do you have? I see that I've missed lots in the chat, I'm sure.
Hey, Scott, I'm not
Yes.
afraid to ask questions. It's Jeremy again.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I need to redo my my fiber contract for this year, or for 2025 on, and we are one of the districts that have a special construction of a new middle school. And so if I'm redoing a contract, what would be the best way of including, if we have an existing middle school that's going to be torn down and a new one built, what would be the best way of including that in our bid to say, we're still going to have the existing middle school for like 2 years of the new contract, but from years 3 through 5, we're going to have to move that fiber to the newly constructed building, and you need to make allowances for that. What would be the best way to word that in my contract to allocate for that?
I think really you kind of touched on it in your question. I think you really just set out exactly what you just said to me in the RFP, or in some sort of supporting documentation to say that, this is the plan. This is, for the first 2 years, service will be delivered here. In the last 3 years, service will be delivered here. And please account for any cost or the special construction that will be necessary between years 2 and 3, and have them outline it in terms of the way that you kind of asked it. The only other thing I would add in with that is to make sure that you have that new entity established in Epic prior to going out to bid.
Well, I don't think it'll change in Epic, since it's just they're tearing down the old one and rebuilding a new one, because it's
okay. So it's just a straight up one building
move
for another kind of change.
That is correct.
Okay.
The school's not changing. It's just they're tearing down the old building where it's unsafe and rebuilding
Gotcha.
a new one.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think I just need to. I see what you're saying. I can
Yeah,
put
I think
in
you just
there
outline that. Yeah, I think you just clearly outline it that for all these other locations, simple delivery of service to each of those locations. However, the middle school, we currently anticipate that there's 2 more years, and then the 3 years following will be in a new location. Please account for how the service costs, or excuse me, the special construction or any other additional costs that might be associated with that move, and then have them respond as in kind.
10-4. Thanks, sir.
Sure thing. For hotspots, can we ask students to pay for the non-discounted portion itself? And can we reuse devices required during the prior USAC program? That's a good question, Clayton. I do not know about the reusing. I'm assuming you're talking about the hotspots that you picked up under ECF. I would think you can. You would just request the service associated with those hotspots on your Form 471, rather than requesting both the cost of the device and the services. That having been said, you'll only get $15 per month. So just be aware that, they won't give you won't have that extra $90. That extra $90 is only for the device itself.
Right. And if we get a service, let's say for $15 a month, and so that's paid for, but then we would have to pay the non-discounted portion of that $15. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And passing that along to students.
To me, that puts teeth in the game for the parents and the students not to lose those devices. If we say, kids, for $36 a year, you can have a hotspot at home. You're responsible for that device. If you don't use that device in 30 days or 90 days or 60 days, then they'll discontinue the service and you lose your $36.
I will say this. I have read in what I have read, and I've gone into and read all of the issuances and utterances of the FCC with respect to this. I have not seen anything that would prevent you from doing that. I would suggest that if that's the direction you want to go, that we dig a little farther into it and check with somebody in USAC and or FCC to make sure that it might be that would be considered resale. I don't know, but we would definitely want to look into that.
Well, if the students are the eligible recipients of the service, then to me, I don't know. I guess we'd have to run it by them. I'm just tossing out scenarios, just thinking, but we had a certain number of students, like it's less than 2% of our kids that didn't have internet service at all at home, and they lost that hotspot capability when that program went away. So this is a way possibly to reach out and to offer them that service back to them. I certainly wouldn't want to offer this to every kid in the district, but for those that qualify or that previously qualified, that might be a consideration.
Yeah, and as mentioned, you wouldn't have the budget to be able to offer it to every kid anyway. So yeah, if you'd like me to pursue that up the ladder with USAC, I'm more than happy to throw that question out there. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious on it.
Okay, I'll see if I can look into it. Well, I know I can look into it. I will add that to an agenda for conversations with USAC folks and get back to you on that.
All right, thank you, Scott. The devices that we picked up, by the way, are previously configured, and I mean they're sitting here. We paid for them under the program already, so we wouldn't necessarily need that allowance to buy new devices. We could potentially, if let's say those are outdated, but we already have devices that are configured for the most part for most of those kids already, the ones that we'd be targeting. So that was the secondary thought on it.
Sure. Yep. Makes sense. I understand what you're.
You might want to check with your You might want to check with your provider on that too, Clayton. I had one district telling me that they had talked to a provider and that there might be a different device or something issued as part of that. I mean, you heard Scott talk about all the different regulations that are part of this loaner hotspot program. So it could be that whatever device you already have, that might be something that they would consider compatible. Like if you picture from maybe bundling this with some potential new program offering for education entities considering this. I don't know. You just might want to double check. And Scott, I was going to ask you, I know you're in the business of giving official guidance, and sometimes I kind of give unofficial guidance, and we sometimes meet in the middle on that. I would say to a district considering this, like if you used, ECF money or last mile internet money, and you did this sort of thing in the past, and then got out of that business of loaning hotspots to users, that this probably, I would not just consider this simply a good invitation to get back in because of all the regulatory things that Scott mentioned, right? There's just a lot of things we're anticipating in terms of what you're going to have to prove and expect and make sure they're not being warehoused and make sure they're being used appropriately and make sure you can account for them and all these things. Now, if you're already, like in Clayton's position, you're already doing this for some of your students, then maybe we have those follow-ups. But I've kind of told some of mine, if you're not doing this now, I wouldn't use this new program as an excuse to get back in that business. And that's probably a little overboard, but that's my unofficial guidance. And Scott, you can shoot me down if needed.
No, you're good. You're good. I'll defer to you on that one. That's wise. Any additional questions? I don't hear any, at least with the recording on. So I will thank you all for attending. I will put in a shameless plug for a week from today where we have another session yet to go. Next week, I believe we will be looking at contracts, mini bids, and filing the Form 470. So I will encourage you to join us for that session as well. And thank you again for being here today